Have you ever had a moment where a single misunderstanding changed the entire course of your life? For Margaret Hayes, that moment came on a freezing winter morning in Chicago, her first day at a new job after a painful divorce and months of unemployment. Nervous, desperate to prove herself. She walked into the grand lobby of a corporate tower and mistook the CEO for the janitor. One small mistake, witnessed by strangers, the kind that could have ruined her chance before it even began. If it were you already carrying the weight of heartbreak and fear, would you apologize and quietly step back? Or would you stand your ground, risking embarrassment just to keep your dignity? What happened next would test Margaret in ways she never imagined, leading her through challenges, small victories, and one extraordinary love story born from the unlikeliest beginning. Stay with me, because this isn't just about romance or second chances. It's about how life's most unexpected moments can lead us exactly where we're meant to be. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I truly love reading them. Now, let me take you to that snowy Chicago morning where it all began. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through Margaret Hayes' coat as she stepped out of the cab and onto the icy sidewalk. Snowflakes clung to her hair, melting just enough to send a cold drip down the back of her neck. She clutched her leather satchel close, trying to steady her breathing. It was her first day at Whitmore Group, the first real job she'd had in nearly 2 years, and she couldn't afford to mess it up. Not today. Not after everything. The glass tower rose above her, its steel frame disappearing into the morning haze. She paused for a second at the revolving door, catching her reflection in the glass. 34. Recently divorced. A resume that had gathered more dust than she'd care to admit. And yet, here she was, about to walk into one of the most prestigious real estate firms in Chicago. Inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of polished marble. The lobby was vast, framed with towering windows that let in the gray winter light. She could hear the muffled click of heels on the tile floor, the low murmur of early conversations, the occasional ring of an elevator bell. Margaret's heels tapped briskly across the floor until she saw it. Right in the middle of the lobby, a dark puddle of water shimmered under the overhead lights. Melted snow, probably from someone's boots. A slip hazard. She frowned. The last thing she needed was to see a partner or client take a fall on her first day. A man stood a few feet away, leaning casually on a mop. He wore a heavy wool coat, its sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal strong forearms. His hair, dark with just a trace of silver, was a little tousled, as if he hadn't given it much thought. He wasn't in a rush, just watching the puddle like it might evaporate on its own. Margaret tightened her grip on her satchel and walked straight toward him. "Sir," she said firmly, keeping her voice polite but authoritative, "could you please take care of that before someone gets hurt? We can't have an accident on my first day." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, and for a moment there was something amusement in his eyes. But he didn't argue. He simply nodded once, then bent to work, the mop swishing over the marble with quiet strokes. "Thank you," she added, already turning toward the reception desk. Her heart was pounding, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the rush of being in this high-powered place. Maybe it was just nerves. She reached for the visitor's sign-in sheet, but before she could write her name, a sudden hush swept over the lobby. She looked up to see one of the floor managers, a man in a sharp navy suit, hurrying toward the man with the mop. "Mr. Whitmore, the board is waiting for you upstairs." Margaret froze. "Mr. Whitmore." The man straightened slowly, resting the mop against the wall. He glanced at her again just for a second, and there it was, the faintest curve of a smile. Then he shrugged off his coat, revealing a crisp charcoal suit beneath. Margaret's mouth went dry. She had just ordered the CEO to mop the floor. Heat rushed to her cheeks. She wanted to melt into that puddle and disappear. But Thomas Whitmore didn't say a word about her mistake. He simply took the elevator, the manager close at his side, leaving her with the muffled hum of the lobby and the echo of her own mortification. Somehow, she signed in and got her temporary badge. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. Great start. Margaret, you've been here 10 minutes, and you've already told your new boss how to do his job. The elevator doors slid shut, carrying her upward not just to the 32nd floor, but into something she couldn't have imagined that morning. Something that began with a mop and a puddle, and would end in a way that would change both their lives forever. The elevator doors slid open to the 32nd floor, revealing a quiet corridor lined with frosted glass offices. Margaret followed the assistant who had greeted her at the reception, her pulse still drumming from the embarrassing moment in the lobby. She told herself it was fine, he probably got mistaken for someone else all the time. Maybe he'd forget about it. That thought evaporated when the assistant stopped in front of a corner office with sweeping views of the Chicago skyline. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you before orientation," the young woman said, her tone polite but firm. Margaret's stomach tightened. "Now, yes." "He asked for you by name." She stepped inside, the thick carpet muffling her footsteps. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a living painting snow-dusted rooftops, the gray shimmer of the river. Behind a massive walnut desk sat Thomas Whitmore, suit jacket draped neatly over the chair, tie loosened just enough to suggest he'd already been working for hours. He didn't look up immediately, flipping through a folder instead. When he finally met her gaze, there was no trace of annoyance, just a calm, assessing focus. "Ms. Hayes," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him, "please, sit." Margaret obeyed, clasping her hands in her lap to keep them still. "I hear today is your first day," he continued, voice smooth, almost conversational. "That's a good thing. You haven't had time to pick up bad habits from the rest of us." She opened her mouth to apologize for the lobby incident, but he lifted a hand. "Don't. You saw something that needed doing, and you spoke up." "That's rare. I like rare." She blinked, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. Then he slid a thick folder across the desk toward her. "Operation Freedom, a charity gala we host every winter. It's in 3 days. Normally, an entire team handles it over a month, but circumstances have shifted." Margaret glanced at the first-page lists of sponsors, venue details, entertainment, catering. Her eyes caught on the bold header, projected funds $200,000, minimum goal. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "What does this have to do with me? I need you to run it." Thomas replied matter-of-factly, "You have 72 hours. She laughed before she could stop herself. "I'm a secretary, Mr. Whitmore. I haven't even set up my email yet." "Exactly," he said, leaning back. "You're unentangled. No alliances, no politics, just the task. Finish it successfully, and you'll prove you belong here. Fail, and—" He let the sentence trail off, the weight of it heavy in the silence. Margaret's mouth had gone dry. She wanted to say no. She wanted to explain that she had no experience in event planning at this scale. But deep down, another voice stirred one she hadn't heard in a long time. "You've been underestimated before. You've survived worse." Her mind flickered to a memory. She was 8 years old, sitting on the porch of their small clapboard house, watching her father, Frank Hayes, polish his old Army medals. His hands were rough, his uniform neatly pressed even though he hadn't worn it in years. "Why do you keep them so clean?" "Daddy," she'd asked. "Because someone paid a price for them," he'd answered without looking up. "And because some things deserve respect even when no one's watching." She'd learned later that he'd struggled after the service lost jobs, nights sleeping in his truck, years trying to rebuild, but he never once let her see him quit. Margaret blinked, the office coming back into focus. Thomas was watching her, waiting. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Because you told me what to do within 10 minutes of meeting me," he said, almost smiling. "That tells me you're not afraid to step in." "I need that." The folder felt heavier in her hands than it should have. Inside was a mountain of logistics, venue coordination, donor management, entertainment scheduling, and all of it had to come together not just for the sake of the company's reputation, but for the veterans who would benefit from the funds. Her heart thudded hard. "All right," she said at last. "I'll do it." Thomas nodded once, satisfied. "Good. My assistant will get you whatever resources you need." "And Margaret?" She paused at the door. "Don't let the weather, the clock, or anyone else tell you it can't be done." In the hallway, she exhaled for the first time since walking in. The weight of the challenge pressed down on her shoulders, but so did something else, a flicker of determination she thought she'd lost after the divorce. After months of rejection letters and ignored job applications, it was crazy. It was impossible. But so was surviving the last 2 years, and she'd done that. As she headed toward the orientation room, the city beyond the glass seemed a little sharper, the snow brighter. She had 72 hours to pull off a miracle. And she wasn't going to back down. By the time Margaret reached her temporary desk, the hum of the office felt sharper, tenser. People were walking faster, phones were ringing more often, and there was a subtle undercurrent in the air like a storm about to break. She had barely opened the Operation Freedom folder when an email alert flashed across her borrowed laptop. Urgent charity gala. All hands meeting. Conference room B. Inside the glass-walled room, a dozen people sat around a long table, their faces tight. Thomas was already at the head, his sleeves rolled up, a legal pad in front of him. Next to him, a young man with perfectly styled hair was scrolling furiously on his phone. Thomas didn't waste time. "Our primary sponsor, Harrington Pharmaceuticals, has pulled out, effective immediately." A low murmur rippled around the table. Margaret froze. She'd seen the sponsorship amount in the folder, $150,000, more than half the projected funds. "Why?" someone asked. "They're dealing with a PR crisis," the young man replied, not looking up. "Something about a defective batch of medication. It's all over the news this morning. They can't be seen spending money on a gala right now." Another voice cut in, an older woman with a pearl necklace and a no-nonsense tone. "Then we cancel. There's no point scrambling for pennies. Better to bow out gracefully than fail in front of donors." Margaret's stomach sank. "Cancel." Just like that, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Canceling isn't an option." "With respect, sir," the woman pressed, "without Harrington, we'll fall short by at least $100,000, and with only 72 hours. Her words faded as Margaret felt all eyes shift toward her. She was the one holding the folder now. She was the one Thomas had just appointed to run this impossible task. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of their skepticism was suffocating. Maybe they're right, she thought. Maybe this is impossible. I'm not an event planner. I don't even know where to start finding another six-figure sponsor on no notice. In her mind, she was back in her apartment 6 months ago, staring at another rejection email while the unpaid bills piled up on the kitchen counter. She'd given up on so many things lately, on finding work, on fixing her marriage, on believing she still had something valuable to offer. But then another memory surfaced, as vivid as if it had just happened. She was 12, sitting at the kitchen table while her father sat across from her with a deck of cards. He'd lost another job that week, but he smiled anyway, dealing the cards with deliberate care. "You know why you keep playing the hand you're dealt?" Maggie he'd asked. She'd shaken her head. "Because the only way to lose for sure is to fold." Back in the conference room, Margaret lifted her chin. "We don't cancel," she said before she could talk herself out of it. The room went quiet. "I don't have all the answers yet," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "But canceling would mean letting down every veteran we promised to help. My father was one of them. He didn't give up when things got hard, and I won't either." There was a pause. Some faces softened, others remained skeptical. Thomas's gaze, however, didn't waver. "Good," he said simply, tapping his pen against the pad. Meeting adjourned. "Margaret, my office in 10 minutes. We'll discuss options." As the others filed out, she gathered her folder, heart still pounding. She wasn't sure where that burst of resolve had come from. Maybe it was stubborn pride. Maybe it was her father's voice echoing in her head. But for the first time that day, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just going to survive this job, she was going to fight for it. By the next morning, the view from the 32nd floor was gone, obliterated by a curtain of white. Snow whipped sideways against the glass, driven by wind that howled between the skyscrapers like a living thing. Margaret stood at the window, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the voice on the other end. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hayes," the event coordinator for the Lakeshore Grand said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "The city has issued a severe weather advisory. Roads are being closed, and the fire marshal has ordered all large venues to suspend events until the storm passes. We can't host your gala on Friday." Her grip tightened on the phone. "It's in 2 days. The storm is supposed to ease by." "It's not up to me," he interrupted. "Even if the ban lifts, we can't guarantee staff or safety. I know this is disappointing, but you'll have to reschedule." Reschedule. The word hit her like ice water. There was no rescheduling. The donors had been promised this date, and any delay meant losing both money and momentum. When she hung up, her desk phone was already blinking with messages. 2 catering companies were backing out due to road closures. A delivery truck had spun out on the interstate. For the first time since accepting Thomas's challenge, Margaret felt the weight of it crush her chest. She sat down hard, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. How do you host a gala without a venue? The conference room was tense when she delivered the news. A few people avoided her eyes. Others looked almost relieved, like this storm had done what they'd been too polite to say outright. Thomas didn't speak for a long moment. He just studied her, as if gauging whether she would fold. Margaret glanced at the snow outside. The city was disappearing under it, streets buried, traffic lights blinking uselessly in the blur. And then, through the fog of panic, a memory surfaced. Her sister's wedding, 5 years ago. The venue had flooded 2 days before, and they'd ended up in a converted warehouse by the harbor. String lights, folding chairs, a borrowed sound system, and it had been perfect. She straightened. I might know a place. 20 minutes later, she was in her coat and boots, battling the wind as she stepped out onto the icy sidewalk. The cab driver grumbled about the weather, but agreed to take her toward the lake. The place was a squat brick warehouse 2 blocks from the water, its roof patched with tin, the loading dock dusted in drifts of snow. A hand-painted sign read, Miller's Marine Supply. Inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and machine oil. Joe Miller himself, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, was behind the counter, oiling a fishing reel. Margaret Hayes, she said, pulling off her gloves. We met years ago. My sister rented this place for her wedding reception. Joe squinted, then nodded. I remember. You're the one who organized that whole thing when the caterer forgot half the food. She smiled faintly. I'm afraid I'm in a similar situation. The gala I'm running just lost its venue. I need somewhere big enough for 200 people, preferably with 4 walls and a roof that doesn't leak. He leaned back, folding his arms. You know there's a blizzard out there. Right folks aren't exactly lining up for parties. It's for veterans, she said quietly. My father was one.
The money we raise could keep a roof over someone's head this winter. I can't just call it off. Something shifted in his expression barely, but she caught it. He set down the reel. You'll have to clear out the inventory, he warned. And the heater's temperamental. I'll bring my own crew and portable heaters if I have to. He grunted, then reached under the counter. A set of keys clinked onto the wood between them. No charge, he said gruffly. Just don't burn the place down. Relief flooded her so quickly it was dizzying. Thank you, Joe. You won't regret this. Back outside, the snow still stung her face, but it didn't seem quite as cold. The cab's heater wheezed as she leaned back, clutching the keys. For the first time all day, she felt it a spark of possibility in the middle of the storm. The storm had eased by Friday morning, but the city was still half buried in snow. Salt trucks rumbled along the main roads, their orange lights flashing through the slush-filled streets. Inside the converted warehouse, Margaret was knee-deep in extension cords, folding chairs, and boxes of donated centerpieces. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. Margaret. The voice on the line was the coordinator from the booked entertainment company. We've got a problem. The band's van is stuck on I-90. State police are diverting traffic, and they won't make it in time for tonight. For a moment, she just stood there, the words sinking in like cold water. No music meant no atmosphere, no energy. The gala would feel flat, lifeless. She pinched the bridge of her nose. Thank you for letting me know, she said, her voice calm even though her stomach had dropped. When she hung up, she scanned the warehouse volunteers stringing lights, a catering crew unpacking supplies, Thomas talking with a donor by the loading dock. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Her mind raced. Think, Margaret. Think. And then she remembered the neon sign she'd passed on the way here, a little bar 2 blocks over. The Rusty Anchor. It wasn't fancy, but she'd seen a small stage inside and a chalkboard sign advertising live music most nights. She grabbed her coat and stepped out into the brittle cold. Snow crunched under her boots as she hurried down the street, her breath forming quick clouds in the air. The Rusty Anchor was dim and warm inside, smelling faintly of beer and fried fish. At the far end, a trio of musicians, 2 men and a woman, were packing up their guitars and a worn upright bass. Hi, Margaret called, walking quickly toward them. I'm sorry to barge in like this, but I need to ask you something important. The tallest of the 3, broad-shouldered, with a knitted cap pulled low, looked up from coiling a cable. We're not taking requests, he said with a small smile. It's not that, she replied, breathless. I'm running a gala tonight for Operation Freedom, a fundraiser for veterans. Our band just canceled because of the storm, and I need live music, something warm, something that makes people feel at home. The woman, slim with copper hair, exchanged a glance with the others. We've already got a set booked here tonight, she said gently. Margaret swallowed, the words catching in her throat. My father served in the army. He came home, and it wasn't easy for him. He fought his way back from nothing, and there were nights we wouldn't have eaten if not for the kindness of strangers. This gala is for people like him. I can't pay you what you're worth,
but I can promise your music will be part of something that matters." The trio went quiet. The copper-haired woman set her guitar case down, folding her arms. The tall man rubbed a hand over his jaw. Finally, the bassist, a man with laugh lines and a calm, steady gaze, spoke. "What's the pay?" Margaret told him. It wasn't much. He nodded slowly, then glanced at his bandmates. "We can play here any night, but maybe tonight's worth more than tips." The woman smiled faintly. "All right, we'll do it." Relief rushed through Margaret so fast she nearly sagged against the nearest bar stool. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll have a van pick you up at 6. Back at the warehouse, the string lights cast a warm glow over the tables, and the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread was beginning to fill the air. Thomas caught sight of her as she came in, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Everything all right?" he asked. She allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Better than all right. For the first time all week, she felt the knot in her chest loosen. There was still a long night ahead, but for now, she'd won one small, vital battle. The next 72 hours blurred into a cycle of coffee, checklists, and frantic phone calls. Margaret moved through the warehouse like a conductor, directing the volunteers who'd braved the snow, one group hanging strings of warm white lights across the exposed rafters, another wiping down the long wooden tables Joe had pulled from storage. The heaters hummed in the corners, struggling against the winter chill that crept in through the old brick walls. She kept a clipboard in her hand, ticking off each item as it was handled. Rental chairs delivered, tablecloths pressed and ready, auction items stacked in neat boxes in the corner, some still smelling faintly of the donors' homes. Her phone never stopped buzzing. A bakery confirming the dessert menu, a florist promising last-minute centerpieces, a volunteer calling to say she'd be late because her car wouldn't start in the cold. She'd barely eaten. Lunch was usually a granola bar in one hand while the other texted a vendor. Sleep came in snatches, 20 minutes on a folding chair while a shipment of linens arrived, a quick nap in her coat as the caterers unloaded trays of glassware. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw lists in her head seating charts, RSVP confirmations, delivery schedules. By the third night, the warehouse had transformed. The harsh smell of oil and dust had been replaced by the faint scent of pine from wreaths hung along the walls. The floors gleamed, and the stage was ready for the band. Even the old brick seemed warmer under the soft glow of the lights. But tonight, she was the only one left. The last volunteer had waved goodbye an hour ago, their boots crunching through the snow as they disappeared into the dark. Margaret stayed behind, sitting at one of the long tables. Her body ached from the cold and from the relentless pace, but her mind was too restless for rest. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was her father's Bronze Star. She'd carried it for years through apartments and jobs and all the rough patches in between. She ran her thumb over the ridged edges, remembering his steady voice. Respect what's worth respecting, even when no one's watching. A gust of wind rattled the metal doors, pulling her back to the present. She stood to lock them and nearly jumped when she saw movement in the shadowed entryway. It was Thomas, dusted with snow, carrying 2 paper cups in one hand and a pair of thick knit gloves in the other. "You're still here," he said, stepping inside. Margaret smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you. I was heading home and saw the lights on." He set the coffee on the table, the rich aroma immediately filling the air. "Figured you might need this?" She wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the heat. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said simply, pulling out a chair across from her. "And I brought these." He slid the gloves toward her. Your hands looked frozen the other night. She blinked, caught off guard by the gesture. Thank you. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping coffee. The hum of the heaters and the occasional creak of the rafters filled the space between their words. You've done more in 3 days than most people could manage in a month, he said at last. I hope you know that. She looked away, hiding the flush that rose in her cheeks. I'm just trying not to let anyone down. He studied her for a moment. Margaret, sometimes you can do everything right, and things still go wrong. But from where I'm sitting, you're giving these veterans and this company more than anyone could ask. Something in his voice made her chest tighten. She wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded. When he left a few minutes later, the gloves were still warm from his hands. She slipped them on, the knit scratching lightly against her skin, and for the first time that week, the warehouse didn't feel quite so empty. By the time the first guests arrived, the warehouse no longer looked anything like a warehouse. Warm golden light spilled from chandeliers borrowed from a local theater, casting a soft glow over the polished floors. Pine wreaths adorned the walls, and flickering candles ran the length of every table. The scent of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and mulled cider filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter as old friends greeted one another. Margaret stood near the entrance in a simple navy dress, greeting guests as they stepped in from the cold. Some shook snow from their coats, others stamped their boots, all of them pausing to take in the transformation. A few even turned to her with wide eyes. You'd never know this was a marine supply warehouse, one donor whispered to his wife.
Did you do all this? Another asked, and when Margaret nodded modestly, the woman squeezed her hand in silent praise. Her band now was already on stage, filling the room with warm, acoustic melodies that seemed to wrap around every corner. The copper-haired singer caught Margaret's eye and winked mid-song. She moved through the room, checking on details without intruding, making sure the auction table stayed organized, asking a volunteer to adjust a heater near the back, quietly thanking the catering staff. Every so often she'd catch sight of Thomas across the room, speaking with donors, his presence calm but magnetic. At precisely 7 o'clock, Thomas stepped onto the small stage. The room quieted instantly. Glasses settling back onto tables, conversations pausing mid-sentence. He looked every inch the CEO in his charcoal suit. But there was something softer in his expression tonight, something that made people lean in. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady and warm. Thank you for braving the weather to be here tonight. Operation Freedom has always been more than just a gala. It's a promise to the men and women who served this country that we see them, we honor them, and we will not forget them. Applause rippled through the crowd, low but heartfelt. This year, that promise almost didn't happen. He continued, 3 days ago, we lost our main sponsor. Then, a blizzard shut down our venue. Our entertainment canceled. And yet, here we are. And that's because one person refused to give up. Margaret felt her breath catch. She had been so focused on making the night happen that she hadn't thought about what it might look like to others. Margaret Hayes, Thomas said, turning to where she stood frozen near the side of the stage. Would you come up here? Please. Her legs felt unsteady as she crossed the floor, the applause swelling around her. People she'd never met before smiled at her as she passed. When she reached the stage, Thomas offered his hand to help her up. This woman, he said to the crowd, took an impossible situation and turned it into the night you see before you. She found us a venue, music, and more importantly, she found a way to remind us why we're here.
The applause this time was louder, a few people even rising to their feet. Margaret felt her cheeks warm, but her heart felt strangely light, as if the weeks of exhaustion had been replaced by a steady hum of pride. When the clapping faded, Thomas leaned toward her so only she could hear. "After my wife passed," he said quietly, "I stopped coming to these events. I stopped feeling connected to any of it. Until you." The words caught her off guard. She looked at him, and for a moment the noise of the room faded into the background. There was a depth in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability she recognized.
Before she could speak, he straightened and addressed the audience again. "In honor of what's been accomplished here, I'm personally matching every donation made tonight." The room erupted gasps, applause, the sound of chairs scraping as people stood. At the auction table, hands shot up, people doubling their bids without hesitation. A man in uniform near the front wiped at his eyes. Margaret stepped back slightly, watching the energy shift. Donors who had been polite but reserved now leaned forward in animated conversation. Volunteers at the back exchanged triumphant looks. The band struck up a livelier tune, the music lifting the room even higher. When Thomas finally stepped down from the stage, the pledges had already surpassed their original goal. Margaret stayed near the edge, letting the joy ripple over her. She thought of her father, of the nights he'd sat in silence staring at unpaid bills, of the way he'd still polish his medals as if to remind himself that his service mattered. Tonight felt like a small way of honoring that. Later, as the evening wound down and the band played a soft, final song, Thomas found her near the back of the room. The crowd had thinned, the scent of pine and candle wax hung in the air. "You saved this," he said simply. She shook her head. "We saved it." He smiled faintly. "Still, I don't think I've seen this room, these people feel this alive in a long time." For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other. She could feel the unspoken things between them, gratitude, respect, something warmer but undefined. Then someone called his name from across the room, and he excused himself, leaving her standing in the soft glow of the chandeliers. Margaret took a slow breath. The night wasn't just a success, it was a reminder. Not just for the veterans they were helping, but for her, that she could still rise to a challenge, that she could still matter. The Monday after the gala, the warehouse stood empty again, tables gone, lights packed away, only the faint scent of pine lingering in the air. But the success of that night didn't fade with the decorations. The pledges kept coming in for days, each email confirmation a reminder that something extraordinary had happened. In the weeks that followed, Thomas called Margaret into his office not for another impossible task, but for an offer. "We've been needing someone to lead our community outreach," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Someone who can think fast, adapt, and most importantly, connect with people. I can't think of anyone better." Margaret blinked. "Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a mission," he replied with a small smile. She accepted without hesitation. Her new role as community advisor became more than just a title. Her days filled quickly morning meetings at local shelters, lunches with veterans groups, site visits to community centers the company funded. She learned the names of volunteers' kids, the stories behind each organization's struggles, and the subtle ways a small gesture could make a big difference. Thomas was often there beside her, not as the CEO in a polished suit, but as a man willing to roll up his sleeves, stack boxes of donated coats, or pour coffee for a long line of guests at a winter food drive. He seemed different in these settings, more at ease, more present. One icy morning, they stood side by side in a cramped church basement, ladling soup into paper bowls. Margaret noticed how naturally he laughed with an elderly veteran about fishing trips on Lake Michigan,
and how he lingered just a moment to listen to a young mother describe her husband's deployment. Later, in the car, with the city skyline ahead and the heat humming softly. Thomas glanced over. "You know," he said, "I've been doing these projects for years, but since you came along, they feel different, better." Margaret met his eyes, her hands tightening around her travel mug. "Maybe it's because we both know what it's like to need these things." His expression softened, a warmth settling there that made her pulse quicken. Before either could say more, his phone buzzed with a meeting reminder, and the moment dissolved. Their closeness grew in small increments. At a fundraiser for a local animal shelter, she caught him watching her from across the room, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. During a late-night planning session, he draped his coat over her shoulders without a word. At a school supply drive, his hand rested lightly at her back as they navigated through a crowded hallway, steadying her against the press of people. Yet neither pushed further. There were no declarations, no grand gestures, just a slow, steady rhythm of shared work and unspoken understanding. Margaret found herself both impatient and reluctant to disturb the balance they'd built. Spring crept into Chicago. The snow receded, replaced by the smell of thawing earth and the chatter of robins. They launched new projects together, a literacy program for veterans' children, a home renovation initiative for disabled service members. Each one brought them into closer orbit. Each one added another layer to their connection. Sometimes, when the day's work ended and the volunteers had gone home, they would linger in the quiet talking about childhood memories, about favorite places in the city, about nothing in particular. Those moments carried a warmth that stayed with her long after she got home. And always, there was that undercurrent, steady, unspoken, waiting. 1 year after the gala, Chicago glowed under a fresh coat of snow. The streets sparkled under strings of holiday lights, and the air carried that mix of pine, cinnamon, and distant chimney smoke that only came at Christmas. The city felt alive, skaters gliding in Millennium Park, bundled shoppers hurrying past decorated windows, bells ringing outside every corner store. Margaret was wrapping up the last details of the company's annual toy drive when Thomas appeared at her desk, wearing a charcoal overcoat and a smile that was just a shade too casual. "Busy tonight?" he asked. She looked up from the donation ledger. "It's Christmas Eve, Thomas. Everyone's busy. How about 10 minutes? I have something to show you." She hesitated. "Does this involve actual work?" "No," he said, his tone light, but with that glint in his eye she'd come to recognize half mischief, half something else. Curious. She grabbed her coat and followed him up the stairwell to the rooftop. The blast of cold air hit her first, sharp and clean. Then she saw it, Chicago spread out beneath them, a glittering panorama of streetlights, rooftop wreaths, and snow drifting lazily down through the beams of nearby lampposts. In the center of the rooftop stood a small Christmas tree strung with warm white lights. Beside it, leaning absurdly against the railing, was a mop. Margaret blinked. "Is that a mop?" Thomas's eyes glinted. "It's the mop, or at least one very much like it." She laughed, the sound puffing into the cold air. "You've officially lost it." Before she could say more, he stepped forward and lifted the mop to reveal a small velvet box tied to the handle with a red ribbon. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" he asked. Margaret grinned, cheeks flushing from both the cold and the memory. "Something about cleaning up a spill." "You told me to mop up a puddle," he said, smiling. And I thought, who is this woman walking into my building, ordering me around? She tilted her head. And yet, here we are. He nodded, suddenly more serious. "Margaret, You've been cleaning out the dust in my heart for the past year. You've brought back the light in places I didn't think could be bright again, and you've made me believe that maybe, just maybe, the best years aren't behind me." Her throat tightened, the city lights blurring for a moment. "Thomas." He took a step closer, snowflakes clinging to his dark hair. "I don't want another year to go by without you knowing exactly where I stand." Then, in one smooth motion, he dropped to one knee in the snow, the velvet box opening to reveal a diamond that caught the glow of the rooftop lights. "So, will you marry me?" The world seemed to narrow to that single moment, the falling snow, the hum of the city far below, and the man looking up at her with steady hope. Margaret's laugh broke into a soft, tearful smile. Yes, absolutely yes. Cheers erupted from behind her. She spun to see the rooftop access door open, spilling out a cluster of familiar faces. Volunteers, friends, even Joe Miller from the old warehouse, clapping and whistling. Someone popped a party cracker. Someone else shouted. About time, Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood, pulling her close as the snow swirled around them. "You planned this," she murmured into his coat. "Only for the last 6 months," he teased. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to hide a mop this long?" She laughed again, shaking her head. "That's probably a first in proposal history." The crowd drifted closer, offering hugs and congratulations. Someone handed her a mug of hot cider, its steam curling into the night air. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her even faster than the cider could manage. After a while, the others returned inside, leaving the rooftop quiet again. The snow had thickened, muffling the city sounds until only the faint chime of church bells carried up from the streets. Thomas still held her hand, his thumb brushing over the new weight on her finger. "I know we have our work, and our projects, and the million things life will throw at us, but if you'll let me, I want all of that with you. Every bit." She smiled, leaning into him as the snow settled on their shoulders. "I think we're already halfway there." They stood like that for a long while, the city glowing beneath them, until the cold finally nudged them back inside. But Margaret knew, even as the door closed behind them, that the night's warmth would stay with her for the rest of her life. The spring air in Chicago carried the first hints of warmth, but the breeze off the lake still held a crisp edge. Rows of folding chairs lined the plaza outside the Veterans Memorial Hall, each one filled with families, service members, and community volunteers. Margaret stood near the stage with Thomas, their hands intertwined. She wore a light gray dress, a small pin on her lapel bearing her father's bronze star. Beside her, Thomas looked both formal and relaxed, his other hand resting in his pocket as he scanned the crowd. Today wasn't about them. It was the ribbon cutting for the new Veterans Resource Center, something they had dreamed up together in a late-night planning session months ago, and had fought to fund through every setback. As the speeches began, Margaret spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Joe Miller from the old warehouse gave her a thumbs up. The acoustic band that had saved the gala smiled from their seats. Even some of the volunteers from that frantic 3-day prep were here, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. When Thomas took the podium, he spoke not as a CEO, but as someone deeply connected to the cause. "This center is more than a building," he said, his voice steady. "It's a reminder that even in the coldest winters, we can create warmth, and that sometimes the smallest moments of conversation, a helping hand, can change everything." He looked at Margaret as he said it, and she felt the truth of it settle in her chest. The ribbon was cut to a round of applause, and people began filtering into the new building. Inside, sunlight poured through wide windows onto shelves of books, a coffee corner, and walls lined with photographs of veterans from the community. Margaret walked through the space with Thomas, greeting guests, answering questions, soaking in the feeling of completion. There was no rush, no looming crisis, just the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. Later, when the crowd thinned, they stepped outside. The plaza was nearly empty now, the flags overhead snapping lightly in the breeze. Margaret took a slow breath. "You know," she said, "if I hadn't mistaken you for a janitor that morning—" Thomas smiled, squeezing her hand. "Best mistake of my life." They stood there in companionable silence for a moment, watching a group of children place small flags around the memorial fountain. Sometimes, Margaret thought, it wasn't the grand plans or the flawless execution that changed a life. Sometimes it was a single misstep that opened a door you didn't even know was there. Her father had once told her that service was about more than duty, it was about connection. Looking at Thomas, she finally understood exactly what he meant. And as they turned to leave, walking hand in hand toward whatever came next, she knew that their story, born of a small, awkward moment, had grown into something strong enough to weather any season. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings arrive disguised as mistakes. Margaret's journey began with an awkward misunderstanding, one that could have closed a door forever. Instead, it opened a path toward purpose, service, and love. For those of us who have lived long enough to carry both regrets and wisdom, her story is a reminder that not every misstep is a failure. Often, it is a redirection. We spend years planning, organizing, and trying to control outcomes. Yet the moments that shape us most are often unplanned. A chance meeting, a misplaced word, or an unexpected challenge can lead to connections we never imagined. But this only happens when we stay open to learning, to forgiving, and to seeing the good in others. For older hearts, it's easy to think our defining moments are behind us. Margaret's story tells us otherwise. The opportunity to change a life or to have our own life changed can come at any time, even in a season we thought was only for looking back. So the next time life surprises you, pause before you judge it as a mistake. It just might be the beginning of something beautiful. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart or brought a smile to your day, I'd be truly grateful if you could like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope, and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support means the world and helps keep these moments of warmth and connection alive.